Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The last hour of daylight faded behind a ridge when Elias Ward rode back toward his ranch. Wind pushed dust across the open field, carrying the smell of rain that had not yet reached the valley floor. Elias sat stiff in the saddle, scanning the distant fence line out of habit. Years of working alone had trained him to expect problems before they appeared. Loose rails, broken gates, anything that could cost him cattle or time. He reached the yard and saw the cabin windows flickering from a single lantern inside. The place was quiet. It usually comforted him, but tonight the stillness increased the heaviness sitting in his chest. The day had been long. The repairs had taken more strength than he wanted to admit. That familiar fatigue reminded him why he rarely spoke to anyone. He had enough to carry without adding new responsibilities. Elias slid off the horse, unbuckled the saddle, and led the animal into the small barn. He brushed its neck, checked its hooves, and forced himself to slow down. Routine steadied him whenever his thoughts drifted toward the memories he worked so hard to keep buried. His wife's illness, the months of helplessness, the silence afterward. The ranch became his shield against anything that might pull him back into that grief. A sharp gust hit the barn doors. Elias stepped out and looked toward the valley entrance. Someone was walking toward the gate. At first he thought the wind or the shifting shadows fooled him, but the figure moved with intention, steady, cautious, tired. As she came closer, her features became clearer under the dim light falling from the cabin porch. An Apache woman, young, but her posture showed she had endured more than her age suggested. Her clothes were dusty, torn in a few places. She carried a small woven bag and nothing else. Her breathing was uneven, and her eyes stayed alert even in exhaustion. Elias remained on the porch, his hand resting near the doorpost. Not a defensive stance, but a bracing one. She was close enough now for him to see the swelling near her cheekbone, a fresh mark that had not fully bruised yet. "Evening," Elias said. His voice came out lower than he intended. He had not spoken in hours. She paused at the gate, steadying herself with one hand. "My name is Tyanida," she said. "I need a place to stay for the night." Elias did not answer immediately. She watched him without fear, but also without hope. She was giving him a choice. He knew this land was empty for miles. No one asked for shelter unless they were out of options. Inside, Elias felt an old tension rise. Having someone in the cabin meant questions, expectations, and a kind of closeness he avoided. But he also recognized the look in her eyes. He had worn that same expression years ago, trying to appear composed while fighting the instinct to collapse. "Did something happen?" he asked. "I left a place where I wasn't safe," she replied. "I won't bring trouble if I can help it." Her voice stayed even, but he heard the strain behind it. She was choosing her words carefully, trying not to reveal more than she must. Elias understood that instinct too well. He weighed the risks. Someone might be searching for her. He might be inviting a problem he wasn't prepared to handle. But leaving her outside in the dark, with the storm rolling in, wasn't something he could accept. Whatever had happened to her, it had pushed her far enough to walk into the yard of a stranger. "Come inside," he said finally. A small breath escaped her chest. Not quite relief, but something close. She stepped through the gate, moving slowly to conserve what little energy she had left. Inside the cabin, Elias set another log on the fire and placed a tin cup of water on the table. Tyanida approached cautiously, not touching anything until he nodded. The glow from the fire revealed more details, scratches on her hands, torn threading on her sleeve, and the way she kept adjusting her breathing to stop the shaking in her shoulders. Elias noticed, and for a moment he felt the old, unfamiliar lightness of empathy. He had spent years avoiding that feeling because it always pulled him into places he didn't want to revisit. Still, he asked, "Do you need medicine?" "A bandage?" "No," she said. "Just rest." She looked around the cabin, studying it the way someone studies a place they hope is safe. Elias realized she was assessing exits, corners, places where danger could come through. She had lived with threat long enough to read rooms instinctively. "What brought you here?" he asked. "I kept walking until I found a place that looked lived in," she said plainly. Nothing more. Not a lie, but not the full truth. Elias didn't press. He handed her a blanket and pointed to the chair nearest the fire. She sat slowly, lowering her weight with care. Facing the flames, she let out a long breath she had been holding since she arrived. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed, unsure what to do next. He wanted to ask more, but asking meant responsibility. And responsibility meant facing the part of himself he had locked away for years. Still, he couldn't ignore the feeling that her arrival had disrupted the emotional distance he depended on. Tyanida looked up at him. "You didn't have to let me in." "I know," Elias said. "Then why did you?" He considered his answer carefully. Not the polite one, not the distant one. "Because I've seen people who needed help and had no one to ask." Something in her expression softened. Not trust yet, but recognition. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, giving the small cabin a quiet warmth neither of them expected to share tonight. Tyanida wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. Elias stayed awake longer than necessary, watching over the place, watching over her, trying to understand why letting a stranger inside felt less frightening than letting his old grief remain in control. Neither spoke again, but the silence carried weight, a sense that both had reached this ranch for reasons deeper than shelter. They were two people avoiding their pasts, now forced into the same space by a valley storm and the quiet exhaustion of survival. The fire burned low, sending a soft, steady glow across the cabin walls. Tyanida rested in the chair closest to the hearth, her eyes half closed but alert enough to track every creak of the wind outside. Elias sat at the table, arms folded, tried to ignore how unusual it felt to have someone else's breathing inside the cabin. He kept the lantern lit, not for light, but because darkness made people uneasy when they didn't know the place. The storm outside reached its full strength. Rain hit the roof in heavy bursts, followed by long stretches of wind that shook the shutters. Elias watched Tyanida's shoulders tighten each time the gusts rose. She didn't flinch, but tension sat across her posture like a weight she couldn't set down. He noticed the way she shifted her feet under the blanket, testing her balance, as if preparing to stand quickly if needed. He realized she was bracing for danger even inside the safest place he could offer. Elias stood and moved slowly toward the stove. "I'll heat some water," he said. "It helps on nights like this." Tyanida nodded once. Her eyes followed him, not out of suspicion, but habit. She had learned not to let anything move behind her without seeing it. Elias didn't take offense. If anything, he respected how carefully she managed her surroundings. It told him she had been forced to survive without support for a long time. He filled 2 tin cups, set them on the table, and gestured for her to sit there instead of near the fire. It took her a moment to decide. She scanned the room again, then stood quietly and approached. She sat across from him, keeping her back near the wall, where she had clear sight of both windows and the door. They drank in silence. The warm water steadied her breathing, and Elias noticed her shoulders relax for the first time since she arrived. After a long pause, she spoke with a careful tone. "You keep this place in good order. You live alone here." "For years," Elias replied. He wasn't sure why answering her felt easier than he expected. "Too far out for visitors, and I prefer it that way." She studied his face for a moment, not judging him, just understanding the kind of man who chose distance over company. "What about you?" Elias asked. "You traveling far?" "Far enough," she said. Her hands tightened around the cup, and she paused before continuing. "I left my settlement 2 days ago. Someone there refused to let me be free of him. When I walked away, he followed. I kept moving until he didn't know where I went." Elias watched the way her jaw tightened as she explained. She wasn't hiding fear, she was managing it. The mark near her cheekbone confirmed her story more than her words. He nodded, not pressing for names or details. She didn't need interrogation. She needed a place where her decisions weren't questioned. She added, "I will leave tomorrow. I don't want anyone's trouble to land on your doorstep." Elias shook his head. "Tomorrow's storm will be worse. You won't get far on foot." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she had expected resistance, but not concern. "I don't plan to stay longer than necessary." "You don't have to rush out," Elias said. "A few days won't harm anything." She looked down at the cup, considering his offer. The idea of staying clearly conflicted with her instinct to keep moving. People who had been hunted struggled to believe in safety, even when it stood in front of them. "If I stay," she said quietly, "I'll work. I won't take anything for free." Elias almost smiled, though the expression felt foreign on his face. There's always work on a ranch. The wind thinned out for a moment, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Tyanida lifted her gaze and looked around the cabin with a different expression, still cautious, but now measuring whether she could settle here even briefly. Her stomach growled faintly. Elias stood and walked to the shelf. "I have dried meat and beans," he said. "It's not much, but it fills a person." She hesitated, then accepted the bowl he placed in front of her. Hunger overpowered pride. She ate slowly, careful not to appear desperate. But Elias saw she hadn't had a real meal since long before she reached his gate. As she ate, he returned to the table and continued repairing a broken bridle strap. She watched the way he worked, focused, steady hands, a man used to fixing things alone. The ease of his movements calmed the room. "Why you live this far out?" she asked. He kept stitching without looking up. "I wanted a place where the past couldn't reach me. Out here, things stay quiet enough to make sense." She listened closely. "And does it help?" "Most days." The simplicity of his answer seemed to resonate with her. She understood what it meant to survive by creating distance. She understood what it cost. After the meal, Elias placed a spare bedroll near the fire. "You can sleep there. The storm won't let up for hours." Tyanida lowered herself onto the bedroll with slow, calculated movements. She kept her bag close, using it as a pillow. Elias dimmed the lantern and checked the door latch one more time before sitting in the chair beside the window. "You're not sleeping?" she asked quietly. "Not yet." Her eyes softened slightly, recognizing his purpose. He was keeping watch, giving her space to rest without fear. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The way she finally allowed her body to settle was enough. The storm continued outside, but the cabin held strong. Elias remained in the chair, listening to her breathing grow heavier, more even. She drifted into sleep with effort, her hand curled around the edge of the blanket. Elias looked at the firelight across her face, bruised, exhausted, but carrying a strength that reminded him of how people survive when the world gives them little choice. He realized she wasn't here by chance. The valley was wide enough for travelers to pass through unseen. Most didn't end up at his gate. Something had pushed her into his path, and now their lives intersected in a way neither asked for but both needed. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and kept his eyes on the shadows moving against the window, staying awake, keeping guard, and trying to understand why protecting a stranger felt more natural than facing his own silence. The night passed with no footsteps outside, but both of them sensed that this was only the beginning. The storm weakened just before sunrise. The steady thudding on the roof faded into scattered drops, and a gray, heavy light crept through the cabin windows. Elias opened his eyes in the chair near the window, his back tight from the hours he spent sitting upright. He stretched slowly, careful not to make noise that might startle the woman sleeping near the fire. Tyanida lay curled under the blanket, her breathing steady, her hand no longer gripping her bag. For the first time since she arrived, she looked unguarded. The bruising on her cheek had darkened overnight, confirming that whoever harmed her had done so recently. Elias studied it with quiet frustration. Not at her, but the thought of someone believing they had the right to corner her, control her, or chase her across the valley. He stood and added a small piece of wood to the fire. The crackle stirred her awake. She lifted her head quickly, scanning the room before realizing she was still safe. "It's morning," Elias said. "Storm's almost finished." Tyanida sat up slowly. Her muscles had stiffened overnight. She adjusted her hair and checked the contents of her small bag, confirming everything was still there. Elias pretended not to notice. A person who had traveled alone for days learned not to assume anything stayed untouched. "You sleep at all?" she asked. "Enough." She didn't challenge his answer. She stood and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, warming herself while the fire built strength again. Outside, the valley looked washed clean. The ground was damp, and a thin mist drifted across the field. Elias stepped onto the porch to check the sky. Low clouds moved eastward. No sign of riders. No fresh tracks near the fence. Tyanida joined him at the doorway, her steps soft on the wooden boards. "I should leave soon," she said. "I've already taken more than one night." Elias shook his head. "The ground's mud. You will make good distance." and you're not in shape to walk through another cold night. I can manage, she said quietly, though her voice lacked certainty. He looked at her directly, measuring the strain she tried to hide. You left because someone didn't treat you right. If he's determined, he'll search the valley. Walking out now won't help you stay unseen. She held his gaze. There was no challenge in her eyes, just the calculation of someone deciding which risk was smaller. Finally, she exhaled. I don't want a problem. People are only problems when you decide they're unwelcome, Elias replied. You're not unwelcome. Her shoulders loosened. Not completely, but enough to show she accepted that he meant what he said. I can work, she offered again. If I stay. There's enough to do, Elias said. Fences are loose after the storm, and the mare in the barn needs someone with steadier hands than mine. She looked toward the barn, her eyes sharpening with interest. You have a wounded animal, a cut on her hind leg. Not deep, but she won't let me near it. Tyanida stepped outside fully and walked toward the barn without waiting for permission. Elias followed a few steps behind, watching how naturally she moved across the wet ground. She didn't hesitate at puddles or uneven soil. She walked like someone who understood land better than conversation. Inside the barn, the mare shifted uneasily when they approached. Tyanida moved slowly, keeping her posture low and calm. She whispered something in her language, soft enough that Elias couldn't hear the words. The horse stopped moving, its ears tilting toward her voice. Tyanida reached the hind leg and examined the wound. It's inflamed, she said. You've been trying to clean it? She kicks, Elias said. I've got the bruises to prove it. You move too fast, she replied. You think like a man with tasks to finish. Horses feel that. Elias let out a short breath, halfway between amusement and embarrassment. She was right. She cleaned the wound carefully using clean cloth and water from the bucket. The mare flinched once, but Tyanida steadied her with a firm, controlled touch. When she finished, she stepped back and wiped her hands on her skirt. She'll heal, Tyanida said. But don't rush her. Elias nodded, realizing she had handled the situation with ease. You've worked with horses before. My people raise them, she said. I learned when I was young. The simplicity of her explanation revealed more than she intended. It gave Elias a sense of a life she had left behind, one that involved responsibility, skill, and community. It also made him wonder what had forced her to abandon it. Back at the cabin, Elias prepared coffee while Tyanida warmed her hands near the stove. The atmosphere felt different now, more assured, less tense. She no longer watched every corner of the room. She still stayed alert, but there was space between her breath that hadn't been there the previous night. Elias poured her a cup. You said you left because someone wouldn't let you be free of him. Is he the type to come this far? He thinks so, she said, but he doesn't know I crossed the valley. You think he'll stop looking? She hesitated, searching for honesty without exposing more than she wished. I think men like him don't like being told no. They come after what they think belongs to them. Elias felt a quiet heat rise in his chest. Not anger at her words, but the man behind them. You're not anyone's property. I know, she said, but some men don't learn that until they're forced to. Her tone carried a calm certainty, not fear. She wasn't running out of weakness. She was choosing survival on her own terms. Elias studied her a moment longer. He recognized strength in her posture, even after days of exhaustion. Strength mixed with uncertainty. Choosing a place to stay meant trusting someone again, something she clearly struggled to do. If you stay here a while, Elias said, you won't be alone if he comes. She looked at him firmly, reading whether he was offering protection or claiming authority. She found neither. She found only steadiness. I'll stay, she said finally. For now. Elias nodded once, accepting her decision without pressure. The morning air shifted, carrying a faint warmth as the clouds continued to move east. The ranch felt different, no longer just a place Elias lived in, but a place that now held another life, another set of footsteps, another set of fears and choices. Tyanida folded her blanket neatly, placed it on the chair, and stepped outside to assess the fence damage. Elias watched her from the porch, noticing how she moved, purposeful, measured, already adapting to the land. For the first time in years, he realized the ranch didn't feel silent in the same way. It felt lived in. The morning stretched into a calm, steady day. The air held a faint chill, but the storm had left the sky clear enough for sunlight to warm the damp earth. Elias stepped onto the porch with a hammer in hand and saw Tyanida already walking the fence line. She moved with purpose, her eyes tracking posts, rails, and the angles where the storm might have loosened the wood. It surprised him how quickly she adapted to the land, as if she had lived there longer than a single night. Elias joined her near the first damaged section. The ground was soft, making every step sink slightly. Tyanida knelt beside a fallen rail and examined it closely. "This one can be lifted," she said. The nails just loosened. Her voice was calm, focused, not a guest asking what to do, someone who understood work and expected to be part of it. Elias lifted the rail while she guided the post into position. Her hands worked with quiet precision, adjusting angles until everything fit cleanly. When they finished the section, Tyanida wiped her palms on her skirt and looked across the field. "How far does the fence go?" "Half a day's walk if you follow it around," Elias said. She nodded, absorbing the scale of the land she had entered. She didn't appear intimidated. If anything, she seemed more grounded now that she had a task. They moved along the fence together. Elias explained the layout of the ranch, the grazing areas, the creek path, the small stretch of forest on the east side. Tyanida listened carefully, asking short, practical questions. "How many cattle?" 32 as of last count. "They roam freely?" "Mostly. They come back to the stream around dusk." "Any trouble with predators?" "A few wolves last winter. Haven't seen them since." Her questions revealed something Elias had not fully understood. She was not simply surviving. She was assessing the place with the eyes of someone considering whether she could belong here, even temporarily. As they continued working, Tyanida paused beside a patch of trampled grass. She crouched and traced a faint track with her fingers. "Someone rode through here yesterday," she said. Elias stepped closer, scanning the ground. "One rider?" "Yes. Heavy horse. Moving fast." The track led toward the far hills, not toward the cabin, but close enough to raise concern. Elias felt a shift in his chest, the familiar tightening that came whenever danger brushed against his land. "He wasn't close to the house," Elias said. "Close enough to see smoke if he wanted to," she replied. She didn't panic, but her posture changed, shoulders squared, breathing slower, preparing herself mentally in case the rider returned. Elias watched her, noticing the controlled tension she carried when threats emerged. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. "You think he was looking for you?" Elias asked. She considered before answering. "Maybe, or maybe he was just passing through. But I've learned not to assume good intentions." Her honesty tightened something in Elias's stomach. "You're safe here," he said. "I believe that," she replied, but her eyes kept scanning the horizon a moment longer before returning to the task. They continued repairing the fence, and the unease gradually settled. The movement, the rhythm of work, helped ease the pressure in both of them. By midday, the sun had dried the grass enough for them to sit briefly near the creek. Elias filled a canteen from the fresh water while Tyanida removed her shoes to cool her feet in the stream. The cold water made her inhale sharply, then relax. "You know this land well," she said. "I've lived here long enough to understand what it needs." Most men focus on owning land, not understanding it. Elias shrugged. "Understanding it is how it stays alive." She looked at him with a brief, thoughtful expression, as if she was learning something unexpected about him. She didn't ask about his past. She didn't need to. She could see the marks of solitude in the way he moved, careful, self-reliant, always bracing for things to break. After a short rest, they returned to the ranch yard. Elias checked the tools while Tyanida went to the barn to see the mare again. He followed a moment later and heard her speaking softly to the animal. Her tone was low, steady, almost soothing. "The swelling is going down," she said when she noticed him. "She trusts me more today." "She barely trusts me on the best days," Elias replied. "That's because you walk like you're carrying too much weight," she said bluntly. Elias blinked, not expecting the comment. "Do I?" "Yes. You move like someone preparing for something bad to happen." He wanted to deny it, say it was just habit or the nature of working alone, but the truth sat too close to her words. "Maybe," he said. "Old years leave marks." She nodded, understanding without asking for explanations. Her silence wasn't distance. It was respect. She gave him room to decide what to share and what to keep buried. They spent the rest of the afternoon fixing the last damaged posts. The work required cooperation, and it forced both of them to learn each other's pace. Elias adjusted to her quick, decisive way of examining problems. She adapted to his slow, steady methods of lifting, measuring, and securing rails. The partnership wasn't smooth at first, but it settled into something natural by the time the sun began lowering behind the valley. Back at the cabin, Tyanida prepared the food while Elias stored the tools. When he returned inside, he noticed how she arranged the space. Nothing invasive, but small adjustments that made the room feel more orderly. The blanket was folded. The dishes were set neatly. The cabin looked less like a place occupied by one man trying to outrun his memories. As they ate, Tyanida finally offered a piece of her story he had not asked for. The man who followed me, he wasn't part of my family. He came from another group, tried to force something that wasn't his right. When I refused, he tried to claim authority he didn't have. My people didn't support him, but he didn't care. Elias listened without interrupting. Her voice remained steady, but the tension in her jaw revealed how deeply the conflict had shaken her. "So you left," Elias said quietly. "I left so he wouldn't hurt anyone defending me. I left so he wouldn't think he owned my choices." That answered a question Elias had held since the night she arrived. Why she walked into the valley alone instead of seeking protection from her own community. "And now you're here," Elias said. "For now," she replied. "Long enough to regain my strength. Long enough to understand whether this place is safe." Elias looked at her across the table. Her presence, though still guarded, brought an unexpected steadiness to the cabin. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't a burden. She was a force shaped by hardship. Just like him, different struggles, same scars. Outside, the sky dimmed into evening. The valley felt quiet, but not empty. Tyanida finished her meal, folded her hands, and said, "Tomorrow we fix the rest of the fence." Elias nodded. Tomorrow. There was no plan beyond that. But for the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like a lonely obligation. It felt like something shared. The next morning brought a hard, dry wind that swept through the valley, carrying dust across the open field and shaking loose the last traces of the storm. Elias stepped out of the cabin early, scanning the horizon with a familiar sense of caution. The land was quiet, but not in a reassuring way. The stillness felt watchful, as if something beyond the ranch was waiting for the right moment to move. Tyanida joined him a few minutes later, tightening the tie of her skirt and pushing loose strands of hair away from her face. Her eyes analyzed the land with the same care he used, first the hills, then the fence line, then the creek. She had not grown up here, yet she read terrain with instinct. "We should walk the far side of the fence," she said. "The posts near the ridge looked weak yesterday." Elias agreed. They set out together, moving at a steady pace across the field. The sun climbed slowly, giving the valley a cold brightness that revealed more than it hid. As they neared the far ridge, Tyanida slowed. "Tracks," she murmured. Elias crouched beside her. The soil had hardened overnight, but the prints remained clear enough to read. A single horse, heavier than any he kept on the ranch, moving at a fast pace. The trail cut a sharp line toward the hills before circling back and disappearing behind the trees. "He passed through recently," Tyanida said. "Not many hours ago." Elias rose slowly. "You think it's the same man?" "I don't know," she said, "but someone rode close enough to see the land." Her voice stayed controlled, but Elias noticed the change. Her breathing tightened, and her stance shifted into something more guarded. Not fear, but preparation. She had lived long enough under threat to anticipate danger without showing panic. Elias scanned the area again. The tracks didn't lead toward the cabin, but they were too close for comfort. Whoever had been there wasn't lost. They were searching. "We'll reinforce the fence later," Elias said quietly. "For now, let's look around the ridge." They walked along the base of the hill, careful not to disturb the ground more than necessary. For a while, there was nothing, just dry brush, scattered stones, and patches of mud drying under the sun. Then Tyanida stopped again. She pointed to a broken branch near the tree line. "Someone watch from here. The view covers the ranch." Elias felt a tightening deep in his chest. Someone had chosen that spot deliberately. They weren't just passing through. He turned to Tyanida. "If he comes again, he might approach from the forest. It gives cover." I know, she said. He likes advantage. He prefers people who can't see him coming. Her calm tone stirred something sharp inside Elias. Not anger at her, but the man who had taught her to expect danger behind every corner. They followed the tracks a little farther until the ground became too rocky to read. Elias stopped there, studying the empty hills. He came alone, he said. A man expecting to capture someone doesn't bring others. He want control. Tyanita nodded, confirming Elias's suspicion that the rider had been searching for her, not passing by. They walked back toward the ranch. The wind picked up, making the grass ripple in uneven waves. Elias understood now that the sense of watchfulness he felt that morning was real. When they reached the yard, Tyanita paused beside the porch post and leaned against it with a slow, controlled inhale. The tension in her shoulders revealed the weight of knowing she might have been found. Elias stepped near her, not too close, but close enough to show he wasn't stepping back from the responsibility he had taken a moment. He opened his door. You don't have to face this alone, he said. I know, she answered, though the words carried the difficulty of someone and used to receiving help. But I didn't mean for danger to come to your home. This land has seen trouble before, Elias said. I didn't build a life here because it was safe. I built it because it was mine. She looked at him with quiet intensity, reading sincerity in his stance, the steady posture, the firm tone, the lack of hesitation. She searched for signs of resentment or doubt and found none. If he comes here, Elias said, he'll leave empty-handed. The directness of his voice made Tyanita straighten. She wasn't reassured out of weakness. She was reassured because Elias spoke as someone who understood danger and didn't fear responsibility. We'll prepare, she said. They spent the afternoon reinforcing weak fence points, securing the barn doors, and checking that the rifles were in working condition. Not with panic, just practical readiness. The kind of preparation people make when they accept risk instead of denying it. During a break, Elias noticed Tyanita scanning the ridge again, her eyes narrowing as she tracked the same distant line of hills she had studied all morning. He approached her slowly. You see something? No, she said, but I feel him getting close. He doesn't give up easily. Elias rested his hand on the porch rail, grounding himself. If he shows up, he'll find out this place isn't open for taking. The wind settled briefly, leaving a calm silence in the yard. For the first time since arriving, Tyanita allowed her shoulders to drop, if only slightly. It wasn't trust fully formed, but it was trust beginning. As the sky dimmed into late afternoon, Elias gathered wood while Tyanita fed the horses. Their movements were steady, coordinated by now into an unspoken rhythm. By the time night arrived, the ranch was quiet again, but not in the lonely way it had been before. There was caution, yes, but also a shared understanding that they would face whatever approached. Elias closed the door, checked the latch, and looked across the cabin at Tyanita. She sat near the fire, her eyes steady, her posture firm. Neither spoke, but both understood. Something was coming, and neither of them intended to face it separately. The morning broke with a tense stillness that neither of them trusted. The wind had softened, the sky was clear, and the valley looked peaceful, too peaceful. Elias stepped outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the ridge where the tracks had been the day before. Tyanita joined him without a sound, her posture tight, her mind working through every possibility of how the man hunting her might approach. The ground bore no new signs, no hoofprints, no disturbed brush, nothing that confirmed their fears, but nothing that eased them either. Elias checked the creek, the barn, and the tree line. Everything appeared untouched. Sometimes he waits, Tyanita said quietly. He likes watching people when they don't know he's there. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. Then he'll see we're not hiding. They went about their morning tasks with a readiness that sharpened their senses. When the cattle wandered unusually close to the barn instead of grazing freely, Elias felt a chill run through him. Animals reacted to what people didn't hear. By noon, the valley heat built up enough to distort the distant horizon. Elias saw movement first, a flicker of dust behind a ridge. A horse, moving with purpose, coming straight toward the ranch. He stepped back onto the porch, his jaw clenched. Tyanita, he called. She emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on her skirt. When she saw the rider, Her expression changed. Not fear, but acceptance that the moment she had tried to delay had finally arrived. The rider approached at a controlled pace, not rushing, not hesitating. A man in his late 20s, broad shoulders, dark hair tied back, wearing clothing that suggested he had come from resettlement. Arrogance shaped his posture. He rode like someone who believed the world owed him obedience. He stopped several yards from the fence, letting the horse stamp the dust. He surveyed the ranch, then fixed his gaze on Tyanida. "Found you," he said with a smirk. Tyanida stepped forward, chin raised. Her voice stayed level. "You need to turn around." "I don't take orders from you," he replied. "You walk away, and you think I'm just going to let you disappear? You belong with me." Elias stepped onto the porch. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply made himself visible, standing between the man and the cabin. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Elias said. The rider looked Elias up and down with disdain. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy." "It does now." Tyanida shifted slightly, watching Elias's stance, knowing he wasn't a man who stepped into conflict lightly. The rider noticed it too. "You think you could protect her?" the man scoffed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Elias didn't lift the rifle. He didn't need to. His voice held the full weight of someone who had lived through enough tragedy to stop being afraid of confrontation. "You're on my land," Elias said. "You'll speak with respect, or you'll leave." The rider's smirk faltered, replaced by irritation. He had expected Tyanida to be alone, frightened, ready to give in. He did not expect someone standing beside her, especially not someone as calm and grounded as Elias. "I came to take her back," the man said. "Her people gave me the right." Tyanida cut him off. "No one gave you anything. You forced your presence on me. You ignored every refusal. You aren't here for justice. You're here because you can't stand someone choosing freedom over you." Her words landed with a precision that made the rider's jaw tighten. "You walked away from your own," he said. "You dishonored." "I left so they wouldn't have to fight you," she snapped. "I protected them by leaving. I owe you nothing." Elias watched the exchange carefully. Tyanida wasn't trembling. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't a victim waiting for rescue. She was standing her ground with the strength of someone who had carried fear long enough to know how to face it. The rider pointed at Elias. "You think hiding behind a man makes you strong?" Tyanida stepped closer to Elias, not behind him, but beside him. "I don't hide behind anyone. I stand with someone who respects my choice." The man's expression darkened. He nudged his horse forward, not enough to cross the fence, but enough to test boundaries. Elias's voice dropped to something cold and unwavering. "Take one more step, and you won't like what happens." The rider stopped. He wasn't foolish enough to ignore the warning. Elias wasn't bluffing. He wasn't threatening. He was stating a fact. "You'll regret this," the rider muttered. Elias didn't react. "Leave." The man glared at Tyanida. "This isn't finished." "It is," she said. "Because I said so." She held his gaze until he finally turned the horse and rode back toward the hills, the dust rising behind him in uneven bursts of frustration. Elias waited until the rider disappeared from view before lowering his stance. Tyanida exhaled slowly, her shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the release of tension she had carried since the day she fled. "He won't come back alone next time," she said quietly. "Then we'll be ready," Elias replied. "And you won't face him alone again." Tyanida looked at him, her eyes reflecting both relief and an unexpected connection she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. The weight of her past pursuit no longer rested solely on her shoulders. It was something shared now, willingly, without condition. As they walked back toward the cabin, the valley air felt different. Not safer. Nothing had been resolved completely. But the ranch was no longer a place where two strangers lived side by side. It had become a place where they stood together. The dust from the rider's departure had long settled, yet the tension he left behind stayed in the air like a faint echo. Elias and Tyanida spent the next day tending the ranch with a heightened awareness of every sound, every shift of wind, every movement on the horizon. But there were no riders, no new tracks, nothing to suggest an immediate return. The silence felt cautious, not comforting, but allowed them enough space to continue with the work that anchored their days. Elias repaired a gate hinge near the barn while Tyanida checked the mare's wound again. The swelling had gone down, and the horse no longer pulled away when she approached. Tyanida stroked its neck, her face softening with a kind of calm she rarely showed. "You've done good for her," Elias said, leaning against the stall doorway. "She just needed time," she replied. "Animals don't fight healing when someone treats them with patience." Elias nodded, understanding the implication even if she didn't intend it that way. Patience was something he had spent years avoiding, especially with himself. Outside, the valley carried a mild sun, bright enough to warm the chilled air, but soft enough to keep the day quiet. The two walked toward the porch after finishing the morning tasks. Tyanida took a seat on the steps, breathing in the open landscape. Elias sat beside her, leaving comfortable space between them, the kind that didn't require explanation. "You built all this alone," she said, eyes drifting across the field. "Piece by piece," he answered. "The work keeps me steady." She studied him for a moment. "Your past, it left marks." He didn't flinch. "It did. You still carry them. So do you." Their honesty didn't strain the silence. It strengthened it. For the first time, Elias felt the old heaviness inside him shift, not leaving entirely, but loosening enough for him to breathe differently. Tyanida wasn't asking for details, and she wasn't offering solutions. She was simply acknowledging what she saw, and for Elias, that was enough. Later, they walked the creek together, checking where the water had risen from the storm. Tyanida moved with quiet ease, her steps measured, her breathing steady. Days earlier, she had walked with tension in every movement, expecting danger at every turn. Now her posture carried something different: readiness without fear, alertness without desperation. "You think he'll return?" Elias asked. "Yes," she said, "but not soon. He'll gather his pride first. He's the kind who believes he deserves obedience. And when he comes, we deal with him," she said plainly. "Not just me." Elias accepted her wording. She was not the kind of woman who sought rescue, and he was not the kind of man who wanted to control her choices. What formed between them was not dependence. It was alliance. Back at the cabin, Tyanida heated water on the stove while Elias sorted tools that had gone unused since the storm. The simple domestic rhythm felt strangely natural. The cabin no longer felt like a place designed around a single man's routines. Her presence had shaped the space without force. Tidier shelves, organized supplies, blankets folded with care. Elias noticed these changes not with discomfort, but with a quiet appreciation. As they ate lunch, Tyanida finally spoke about something she had held back. "You asked why he wants to claim me," she said. "There are men who think authority is a right they earn through persistence, not respect. He's one of them." Elias listened without shifting his expression, but inside he felt a controlled anger at the man's entitlement. "I left before my people had to take sides," she continued. "I left so no one else would bleed because of me." Elias set down his cup. "You didn't cause the conflict." "He did." "Yes," she said softly, but leaving was the choice that protected them. The explanation filled a small gap that had lingered since her arrival. Elias now understood why she walked alone through dangerous land instead of seeking support from her community. Her decision had been one of responsibility, not escape. In the afternoon, they worked on repairing a weak rail near the corral. As they lifted the wood together, their movements fell into an unspoken rhythm. Elias bracing the weight, Tyanida adjusting the angle, both of them responding to each other's timing with ease. When the task was done, Elias noticed how the sun caught the faint bruising on her cheek. It had begun to fade. Healing had reached her body just as it had begun reaching her thoughts. "You're stronger than he ever understood," Elias said quietly. Tyanida looked at him, surprised by the directness of the compliment. "Strength is only useful if it doesn't harden you," she replied. "I don't want to live in fear. I want to live in peace." Elias nodded slowly. "You can find that here." He said it without hesitation, without second-guessing his own readiness to share the land with someone else. She heard the sincerity and accepted it with a subtle shift in her expression, a mixture of relief and something deeper she hadn't allowed herself to feel. As the day settled into evening, they sat on the porch again, watching the valley fall into long shadows. The quiet between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like understanding. It felt like two lives adjusting to each other, almost unconsciously. Tyanida leaned forward slightly, hands clasped between her knees. "Thank you," she said, "for standing with me." Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. "You didn't ask me to. That's why it mattered." They stayed there until the light faded completely. The ranch was still, but not empty. The land finally carried a sense of safety, not because danger was gone, but because they had chosen to face it together. Early light crept into the valley the next morning, casting a clean, pale glow across the open field. The stillness held no threat this time, only the steady rhythm of a ranch returning to its normal pace. Elias checked the corral gates while Tyanida carried feed to the horses. The mare nickered softly when she approached, lowering her head in an unmistakable gesture of trust. Tyanida smiled, a small expression, but one that revealed how much calmer she had become. Elias watched her a while before continuing his work. Something about the way she moved, focused, grounded, certain, made the ranch feel fuller than it had in years. Not crowded, not disrupted, simply steadier. By mid-morning, they began repairing the roof section loosened by the storm. Elias climbed the ladder first, securing the boards while Tyanida handed him tools for below. Their coordination had grown natural, each anticipating the other's pace without speaking. When the repairs were done, Elias came down the ladder slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "You work like someone who's used to doing everything alone," Tyanida said as he reached the ground. "I was," Elias replied. "For a long time." "Not anymore," she said. Her tone held no challenge, only a quiet truth that reached him more deeply than she probably realized. He carried that thought with him as they walked toward the shed to store tools. When they reached the doorway, Elias set the hammer down and leaned against the frame. "You've changed this place," he said. Tyanida paused. "Ow, it feels different with you here. Not lighter, just more alive. More real." She blinked, taking in his words with a seriousness that showed how much she valued sincerity. "You've changed things too," she said. "You gave me a place to breathe again." He studied her face, the faint scar at her brow, the fading bruise, the strength that remained even when exhaustion tried to pull her down. He knew she was rebuilding herself piece by piece, and he knew he had become part of that process. The realization didn't frighten him the way closeness once had. It steadied him. After storing the tools, they walked to the creek to refill water buckets. The afternoon sun warmed the air, and the gentle flow of water filled the silence with a quiet rhythm. Tyanida stepped onto a flat stone near the bank, her reflection broken by the ripples. "Before I came here," she said, "I didn't know where I belonged anymore." Elias crouched beside the water. "And now, I'm still learning. But this place, it feels like something I didn't expect to find." He waited, not pushing, not assuming. She continued, her voice low but certain. "You gave me safety without conditions, respect without asking anything in return. That matters more than you think." Elias felt a slow rise of heat in his chest, gratitude, responsibility, and something deeper taking form. She looked at him then, directly, not guarded, not uncertain. "I want you to." The words were steady, not rushed. They carried no desperation, no demand, only truth. Elias held her gaze, letting the weight of her confession settle. His heartbeat steadied rather than quickened. He felt no panic, only a sense of clarity he had not known in years. "I didn't expect to hear that," he said softly. "I didn't expect to say it," she answered. "But I meant it." He stood slowly, offering his hand without force. She placed her hand in his, trusting the contact. Her fingers were warm, firm, familiar now. When he helped her step off the stone, she didn't let go immediately. "You don't owe me anything," Elias said. "Not this. Not gratitude. Not a place here." "It isn't about owing," she replied. "It's about choosing." Her steadiness pulled him closer, not physically, but emotionally. She wasn't seeking rescue. She wasn't seeking ownership. She was choosing connection. They walked back toward the ranch side by side, not touching but not distancing either. The space between them had changed, no longer shaped by caution, but by something deliberate and mutual. Later, at the cabin, they prepared supper together. Elias chopped vegetables while Tyanida tended the fire. Their quiet was no longer a shield. It had become a language. When their hands brushed as they reached for a pan, neither pulled away. After eating, they sat on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the ridge. The sky darkened into a smooth gradient, steady and predictable. There's something I need to tell you, Elias said. Tyanida turned to him. This ranch was the only place I trusted after I lost everything. I kept people away because letting anyone close felt like losing control. But with you here, I don't feel alone, and I don't feel afraid of that anymore. Tyanida absorbed his words quietly. I don't want to replace your past. I just want to be part of what comes next. He nodded. You already are. The porch fell into silence again, but this time it was filled with something warm. Two lives aligning without force, without rush, without questions hanging in the air. Inside the cabin, the lantern glowed softly. Outside, the valley settled into night. The ranch was no longer a temporary shelter for her or a solitary refuge for him. It was becoming a shared place, a chosen one. The next morning brought a soft, warm light that settled gently over the ranch. Birds moved along the fence line. The cattle grazed near the creek, and the valley carried a sense of calm that felt earned rather than accidental. Elias stepped out onto the porch with 2 tin cups of coffee. Tyanida was already outside, standing near the corral with her hands resting lightly on the top rail. When she heard his steps, she turned, a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes that reflected a new steadiness between them. He handed her a cup. Morning. She accepted it with a faint smile. Morning. They drank in silence, the kind of silence that had grown warm instead of guarded. The confession she had given him the day before, her simple, steady, I want you too, still echoed inside him, but not in a way that unsettled him. It grounded him, reinforcing a truth he had felt forming long before she spoke it. When they finished their coffee, they set out to check the grazing field. The cattle had wandered farther than usual, and the two walked side by side, their steps aligning without effort. The ground was dry, but the grass held enough color to support the herd. We should move them to the west pasture by tomorrow, Elias said. Grass is thicker there after the storm. I'll help with the drive, Tyanida replied. I can guide from the ridge. Her tone carried certainty, not suggestion. She wasn't offering assistance as a guest. She was taking responsibility as someone invested in the land. As they walked, she paused near the creek, crouched, and inspected a cluster of fresh prints. Deer, she said. A small group passed through in the night. Elias watched her with a mixture of admiration and appreciation. She was reading his land as fluently as he did. She was learning not just the geography, but the patterns, the rhythms, the quiet signs that shaped every day of ranch life. They continued through the property, fixing a loose board here, checking a gate there. By midday, they were mending a section of corral together. The work required them to stand close, handing tools back and forth in a comfortable rhythm. You think he'll return soon? Elias asked, meaning the rider who had confronted them. No, she said. He'll wait until he believes I've lowered my guard. But he doesn't know this place, and he doesn't know you. Her voice didn't carry fear. It held assurance, confidence in her own strength, and in the partnership they had built. Elias hammered the last nail into place and stepped back. I'm not worried about him. Tyanida studied him for a moment. You were alone for a long time, Elias. Now you're choosing something different. That takes courage. He didn't reply immediately. Her words hit closer to the truth than he expected. Maybe, he said, or maybe it's just time. She accepted that with a quiet nod. In the afternoon, they prepared the west pasture for grazing. Tyanida cleared brush while Elias repaired a water trough. The sun hung high, and the work was steady and honest. At one point, Elias looked over and saw her wiping sweat from her brow, her expression determined, her movements efficient. She wasn't simply adapting, she was thriving. When they paused to rest, Elias finally addressed a question that had lingered unspoken. What would you do if you had no one chasing you? He asked. If the past no longer held you back? Tyanida considered the question with surprising seriousness. I would choose a place with purpose, she said. Not because I needed shelter, but because I wanted a life worth building. She looked at him then, direct, open, steady. And I think I've found that place. The honesty in her voice struck him harder than any confession before. Elias felt something shift inside him, something long dormant and now unmistakably present. By late afternoon, they moved the cattle toward the west pasture. Tyanida guided them from the ridge as promised, using subtle movements and calls to keep the herd together. Elias watched from below, impressed by how naturally she took command. When the work was done, she rode one of the quieter horses down the slope, her posture confident and sure. "You ride well," Elias said. "I grew up on horses," she replied. "They listen when you treat them like equals." He smiled at that, a small one but genuine. As evening settled, they returned to the cabin. Tyanida cooked while Elias fetched more firewood. The cabin smelled of warm stew, and the lantern cast a soft glow across the walls. When they sat at the table, the meal felt less like two people sharing space and more like the beginning of a life shaped together. After they finished eating, Tyanida stood near the window and looked out over the darkening valley. "I never expected to stay anywhere long enough to plan for tomorrow," she said. "You changed that." Elias walked to her side, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel his presence. "And you brought something back to this place that I didn't realize I'd lost." She turned toward him, her eyes steady, her breath calm. Their closeness felt natural, earned, not rushed. Neither of them needed to define it aloud. Outside, the ranch rested in quiet stability. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Together, they stood at the window, looking out over a land that no longer belonged to just one of them. The following morning began with an unusual clarity. The valley stretched wide under a clean blue sky, the kind of day that invited work, rest, and decisions. Elias stepped outside first, scanning the ridge out of habit. For the first time in many days, he felt no apprehension as he looked toward the hills. The air carried no tension, no trace of a rider approaching, no sign of disturbance. Only stillness and open space. Tyanida exited the cabin moments later, adjusting the strap of the water bucket she intended to carry to the barn. Her movements were calm, purposeful, and free of the tightness she had worn when she first arrived. When she caught Elias watching the hills again, she joined him on the porch. "He won't come today," she said, not as hope, but as observation. "You're certain?" Elias asked. He left angry, not strategic. Men like him need time to rebuild their pride before trying again. And when he does return, he'll bring others. But he won't find me alone. Elias nodded. She was right, and he was prepared. They spent the morning tending the cattle in the west pasture. The herd moved easily under their guidance, responding to Tyanida's steady signals from the ridge and Elias's direction from below. Their coordination had become natural, the result of days spent working side by side. When the herd settled, they met at the fence line. "You've taken to this place quickly," Elias said. "I needed a place that didn't ask me to become someone else," she replied. "This land accepts who I am." He understood that more than she knew. Silence lingered between them. Not heavy, not uncertain. Just the presence of two people learning to share the same ground. After finishing the morning work, they returned to the cabin. Elias fetched fresh water while Tyanida prepared a simple meal. She moved with familiarity through the space, as if the cabin had already become an extension of her routine. As they ate, she spoke with a seriousness that drew his full attention. "I want to make something clear," she said. "The man who followed me, he didn't pursue me because of tradition or duty. He pursued me because he believed he had power over me. My leaving wasn't running away. It was choosing not to let him decide my life." Elias listened. Her explanation filled one of the final gaps in her story, a truth she had withheld until she felt steady enough to speak it. "You owe him nothing," Elias said. "I know," she replied, "but I needed you to understand why I won't return to my old life. I'm choosing a new one." He met her gaze. "Where do you want that life to begin?" She didn't hesitate. "Here, if you want that too." Elias felt the weight of the moment settle through him. Not crushing, but solid. The ranch had been his refuge, his shield against memories he could barely face. Yet having her here didn't reopen his old wounds. It eased them. Her steadiness had given him back a sense of purpose he thought he had buried with his past. "I want you here," he said. "Not because you need a place to stay. Because this ranch feels like a home with you in it." Her breath softened, and for a moment she looked younger, relieved, grounded, certain. They stepped outside after the meal, walking toward the barn to check the mare. The horse greeted Tyanida with a gentle nudge, healed and calm. Tyanida stroked its neck, then turned to Elias. "I'd like to build a small garden behind the cabin," she said. "Herbs, vegetables, things we can use year-round." Elias smiled quietly. We'll do it together. The day stretched into a warm afternoon. They repaired a broken wheel on the wagon, cleared fallen branches near the creek, and planned how to expand the grazing area come spring. Their voices remained calm, their decisions mutual. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt rushed. When evening arrived, they sat on the porch as the sun sank behind a ridge. The valley glowed in shades of deep gold and fading blue. Tyanida rested her hands on her knees, leaning forward slightly as she watched the cattle settle near the creek. Elias sat beside her, close enough to feel her presence but not intruding on her space. This land will be good for both of us, she said softly. It already is, he answered. After a long quiet, she turned to him. There's one more thing I want to ask. He waited. If the day comes when he returns with others, if conflict is unavoidable, will you trust me to stand with you, not behind you? Elias's answer came without thought. Yes, because that's what we are, partners. Equal. Her expression warmed, and she nodded with slow certainty. The sky darkened fully then, the first stars appearing above the valley. A soft breeze passed over the yard, carrying the scent of the creek and the steady hush of the evening. Tyanida leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing his. Not an accident, not a question, but a quiet truth accepted by both of them. Elias didn't pull away. He let the moment settle, feeling the weight of loneliness finally lift in a way he had never expected. Inside the cabin, the lantern glowed through the window, lighting a home no longer defined by one person's survival, but by two people's choice to build something new. The ranch had found its balance again. Tyanida had found safety without surrendering strength. Elias had found purpose without losing himself to the past. And together, they had chosen a life, steady, honest, shared. The story closed not with uncertainty, but with the quiet certainty of a future they would build side by side.